What's going on, guys? My name is Matt, and today I'm going to show you what honestly might be my best price to performance PC I've ever built. A few weeks ago, I gave myself the challenge of putting together a gaming PC for only $150. I've done sub $200 PC builds before, but they've all been upgrading pre-builds. This build is completely custom, and I'm really proud of what I was able to put together for this price. This system has a quad-core CPU, dedicated graphics card, and ample RAM. I'll go over benchmarks later in the video, but just as a bit of a teaser, this system is able to play Fortnite at 1080p with competitive settings at well over 100 FPS average. So now that you've got an understanding of what kind of system this is, let's go ahead and talk about the components that make up this $150 gaming beast. For this CPU, I went with what is in my opinion one of the most underrated and underutilized budget CPUs ever. Well, what I went with is the Intel Xeon E3-1230. This CPU gives almost identical performance to an i7-2600, but consistently sells for around $40, whereas the i7 usually sells for around $65. The only major difference between the two is the Xeon doesn't have integrated graphics, which doesn't matter to me because this is going into a gaming PC with a dedicated graphics card. I was patient and waited for a deal and actually picked one up, buy it now, for just over $30. The E3-1230 is a quad-core CPU with hyperthreading that fits into standard consumer LGA 1155 boards, so no weird server boards needed here. It has a base and boost clock of 3.2 and 3.6 GHz respectively, which definitely isn't the fastest clock speed ever, but it's more than adequate for most games you throw at it. Like I said before, this is an LGA 1155 CPU using the legendary Sandy Bridge architecture, and as you'll see in the benchmarks, for under $40, this is an incredible value for the money. The motherboard this is going into is actually a pretty interesting solution for building cheap custom PCs on a budget. What I chose is actually a Micro ATX LGA 1155 motherboard from a Dell Optiplex. These boards are dirt cheap and readily available. This one I picked up for under $15, buy it now. You can find them a little bit cheaper, but this one included an IO shield, which a lot don't, so I figured spending the extra couple bucks was worth it, as having the IO shield will make the build look more polished and put together than if the IO shield were missing. This board doesn't look great, but the 4 expansion slots and 4 DIMM slots could allow us to upgrade the system later down the line for even more performance. The biggest downside of this board is the proprietary front panel connectors and fan connectors. To get around this, I went onto Google and searched for the front panel pinout. Once this was found, I just made sure I could hook the power button up, as I don't really care about the front panel LEDs. This was relatively simple and works like a charm. Front panel USB 2 is the same as a regular motherboard, and the only functionality we lose is the front panel audio, which isn't great, but it's definitely something I can live with because of how cheap this board was. The other minor downside is the lack of USB 3. This isn't a deal breaker, and a USB 3 PCIe card can be added later down the line, which wouldn't cost very much and could be pretty helpful for a lot of users. Now let's go ahead and talk about the cooler I use for this CPU. Both the CPU and extra fan headers on this board use a 5-pin non-standard connector. The solution to this is pretty simple. You just pick up these conversion cables off eBay for $1 or less and use whatever fans you want. But for ease of use, I went with the standard Dell Optiplex CPU cooler. This is installed very easily and is more than adequate at cooling our CPU. This is basically a big hunk of aluminum with a 92mm fan on it. For the $8 I spent, I could have bought an adapter and cheap CPU cooler, but it would have come out to the same price, but probably would have been more difficult to install. This is a little more than I would have wanted to spend on a cooler, but at the end of the day, $8 versus $5 isn't gonna wreck the budget. Moving on to RAM, this system takes DDR3, which is pretty cheap on the secondhand market, and if you're patient, you can find some really good deals on it. When I was getting parts for this system, I found a listing for 2x4GB kits of DDR3 1600MHz RAM going $14 a piece, free shipping, and buy it now. This is a great deal, and I ended up picking up 3 of these kits, but only used one for this build. Because this is 2 sticks of RAM, it means the kit is running in dual channel operation, which does help performance a little bit. 8GB is good for most latest games, but I have found more modern games to be taking advantage of more than 8GB, so upgrading in the future might be a good idea. This upgrade would be super simple because after this 8GB is installed, there are still 2 open DIMM slots, meaning you could just pop in 2 more 4GB sticks later down the line for a total of 16GB, which is great for modern gaming, and it will be a very long time before games start to utilize the full 16GB. For storage, I went super basic and purchased a refurbished 500GB hard drive for $15 on eBay. This is Seagate drive, which is a pretty reliable one, and 500GB is plenty to get someone up and running with a good number of games. If I had $15 more in the budget, grabbing a 240GB SSD and upgrading mass storage down the line would have been a really good way to go, but because the budget was so limited, this seemed to be the best option, and it works fine for this build. In terms of the graphics card, this was an area I really wanted to take my time and find a good deal for, because this is going to be the one part with the biggest impact on gaming performance. I looked at a ton of different options, but many were out of the $35 price I budgeted for a GPU. After a little bit of searching, I found an Nvidia GTX 660 Ti for around $32 buy it now, which offers a pretty good value for the money. This is the Asus DirectCU2 model, which is one of the best 660 Ti variants. It has a really beefy heatsink with a number of nickel-plated copper heat pipes and a good-sized aluminum fin array. This card requires 2 6-pin power connectors and overall is a pretty large card. One thing I made sure to do was change the thermal paste on this card, which is something I always like to do for old cards. For someone new to PC hardware, this may seem kind of intimidating, but in reality, it takes less than 10 minutes and can have a big impact on thermals, noise, and if the card is thermal throttling, then also performance. All I had to do was remove the 4 spring-loaded screws on the back of the board and separate the PCB from the cooler. Most people unplug the fan connector, but as long as there isn't tension on it when the card is open, then there isn't really any need to do this. Once the card is open, it means it's time to remove the old thermal paste. I used alcohol wipes to clean the old thermal paste off, and lightly used a flathead screwdriver to remove big chunks off the cooler. Don't apply much pressure at all so you don't scratch up the copper plate on the cooler. See how the thermal paste is coming off in chunks? This is because the thermal paste has cured over time, and in the process of curing, it's lost some of its thermal transfer properties. Once this was completely clean, I put on a healthy dollop of paste, and I like to spread it around to ensure even coverage. Even coverage is very important because we're interfacing with the cooler directly on the processor die, versus with a heat spreader like we find on CPUs. Once this was done, I simply reassembled the card in the reverse order I opened it. Also make sure to test the card before changing the thermal paste, just so you're sure it works before going through all the effort of doing this, just to have to return it later. The 660 Ti is pretty much good for all the popular esports titles today, and can even handle some light AAA games. At only $32, this is a great value for the money and works really well in this build. Powering the system is an EVGA 600W 80+ certified power supply. I picked this up a while ago on an EVGA B-stock sale for only $15. Whenever these go on sale for this price, I always make sure to pick up at least a few of them as they are perfect for budget builds. 600 watts is way more than enough for this build, and these units are rock solid with great reliability. I've used probably a dozen of these in channel builds and builds for friends, and I've never had a problem with any of them. Make sure to check out EVGA B stock on Wednesdays, as that's when items go on sale, and some weeks you can find great deals. The power supply is not somewhere you want to go with a generic no-name unit. It's imperative to go with a unit from a reputable manufacturer like EVGA or Corsair. Finally, I need a case to house all of these components, and it took me a few weeks to find the right one. After waiting patiently, I found this DIY PC MA08. I got this one on sale for $22 out the door, and honestly, it's one of the best sub $30 cases I've ever worked in. Where it lacks in a side panel window, it makes up for in many other areas. It has 2 included fans with options for 3-pin or Molex on each, which is perfect because I only had 1 extra header on the motherboard, so one I used an adapter and one I used Molex. The front of the case has a mesh intake, which is awesome to see, and overall the aesthetic is pretty good in my opinion, and subjectively looks a lot better than some of the $20 Rosewell cases myself and others have used in the past. This case also has a removable support bracket that makes it easier to work in, and overall this case is incredible for the money. Just like most budget PC cases, this isn't the easiest to work in because of its size, but it's in no way the hardest case I've ever had to build in. Overall, building the PC went pretty smoothly and I'm pretty happy with the end result. Cable management is definitely not the best, but there isn't a side panel window, so it's not a big deal. Once assembled, I installed unactivated Windows 10, which is free, and the only downside is this little watermark in the bottom right corner of the screen. I have a full video about this, which I'll link in the card above and description down below. Once Windows was installed, it meant it was time to start testing out some games. I tested 4 games I think someone building a system like this would play. These include CSGO, Overwatch, Fortnite, and PUBG. Going into this, I knew stuff like CSGO would be fine, but honestly wasn't sure if a game like PUBG would be playable, so what I did was start with the easier games and worked my way up. Starting with CSGO at 1080p high settings, the system produced an average of 135 FPS with 1% lows of 75. Obviously, if you lower the settings to something more competitive, you're gonna get higher frame rates, but this seemed perfectly fine. Next up is Overwatch, a game I used to play a lot, and a game that's still fairly popular. I used the settings it defaulted me to, which was high, and at those settings the system received an 88 FPS average with 1% lows of 61. This means it almost never dropped below 60 FPS. This was a great experience and it was fun hopping into a game I haven't played in a while. Next up is Fortnite. I played at 1080p competitive settings, which I'll have the exact settings on the screen, and I was really surprised at the performance I got. The system produced an average of 110 FPS with 1% lows of 70, which was a phenomenal experience. It seems like Fortnite optimization has been getting better and better as time's gone on. Lastly, I tested what was the final boss battle for this PC, which is PUBG, one of the hardest esports titles to run. I tested at 1080p medium settings and surprisingly got a 62 FPS average. 1% lows weren't great, being at 37, but overall it was a decent experience. To be honest, the system at only $150 performed better than I expected it to. One thing to point out is that most of the time the GPU was at 100%, while the CPU was only around 50 to 60. This means the system could handle a much stronger graphics card, which is something I may explore in a future video, and if that's something you'd like to see, let me know in the comment section. In the end, building a custom gaming PC for $150 wasn't an easy task. There are some obvious compromises, but you can't deny the price to performance with this system is great. I think the next few budget builds will be above the $300 price point, just because I've done a few of these super low-end builds this year, so if there's a certain price point you want to see, let me know down below. With all that being said, I think it's time to wrap this video up. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to hit that like button as well as consider subscribing, and as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.